Hi everyone, welcome to The Expansive Mind. Today, we're diving into one of the most intense periods in British history, the lead up to the English Civil War. Who's really to blame for this conflict? Was it Charles I with his stubbornness and misjudgments? Or was it Parliament, pushing their demands too far? Let's explore the key events and see how things escalated to a breaking point in 1642. Setting the stage. Why civil war didn't seem likely in 1640. If you went back to 1640 and told people that a civil war was coming, they probably wouldn't believe you. At that time, there wasn't even a royalist party. Sure, there was tension, especially after Charles's personal rule, those 11 years he ruled without parliament. But most people thought things could still be worked out. The big problem, though, was how Charles handled things during those 11 years. He did stuff like imposing ship money, essentially a tax without Parliament's approval, and tried to enforce religious reforms through Archbishop Laud. Puritans hated this because it felt too Catholic. And then came the moment that really kicked things off. Charles tried to impose a new prayer book on Scotland in 1637. The Scots rebelled, leading to the bishops' wars. He lost, twice, and was so broke he had no choice but to summon Parliament in 1640. That's where things started to get messy. The radicalization of Parliament. When the Long Parliament first met in 1640, they were surprisingly moderate. They passed the Triennial Act, which just said Parliament had to meet at least once every 3 years. That seemed reasonable, right? But things started to change. John Pym and his allies in Parliament, let's call them the Radical Group, began pushing for bigger changes. And by 1641, they were making demands that went way beyond what most people were comfortable with. One of the most important things they did was pass something called the Grand Remonstrance. Now, this document listed over 200 complaints about Charles, from his abuse of power during personal rule to his poor handling of the bishops' wars. But it didn't stop there. It also suggested that Parliament should have control over royal ministers and military appointments. Basically, they were saying, we don't trust the king to run the country. And here's the thing. The Grand Remonstrance barely passed. It was approved by just 11 votes, and 200 MPs didn't even bother voting. That shows how divided Parliament was. People were starting to choose sides, and this division was crucial. It was one of the first signs that war might actually happen. The 19 propositions. A step too far. By June 1642, Parliament had gone even further with something called the 19 propositions. These were demands that no respectable king could agree to. For example, Parliament wanted to control the militia, decide who the king's advisors should be, and even oversee how the king's children were raised. Can you imagine? For someone like Charles, who believed in the divine right of kings, this was unacceptable. Honestly, it wasn't just Charles who thought they'd gone too far. Many moderate MPs also felt these demands were ridiculous. When Charles rejected the propositions, it was pretty much the final straw. Parliament and the king both started preparing for war because, at this point, there was no middle ground left. The Militia Ordinance. In early 1642, Parliament passed something called the Militia Ordinance. This took control of the country's local militias, essentially the army, away from the king and put it into Parliament's hands. What made this move even more controversial was that they passed it without Charles's consent. That was a huge breach of the Constitution. The ordinance was a massive deal because it directly challenged Charles's authority. It wasn't just a matter of security, it sent a clear message that Parliament didn't trust the king with the military. This action pushed many moderates, who might have been willing to work with Parliament, over to Charles's side. They saw this as Parliament going too far and upsetting the balance of power. The Army Plot. Another significant event was the so-called Army Plot of May 1641. Parliament, led by John Pym, revealed alleged plans to use the English army to dissolve Parliament and free Strafford, who was then imprisoned in the Tower of London. Charles and his wife, Henrietta Maria, were suspected of being involved, and their secrecy only fueled suspicion. Although the details of the plot were never fully verified, Pym used it as proof of a popish conspiracy, and portrayed Charles as someone who couldn't be trusted. For Parliament, This event reinforced their belief that Charles would stop at nothing to restore his authority, even if it meant using military force against his own people. The revelation of the army plot escalated mistrust and provided radicals in Parliament with ammunition to push for further reforms against the king. Charles's mistakes. But let's not put all the blame on Parliament. Charles made a lot of mistakes that didn't help the situation. For example, in January 1642, he tried to arrest 5 MPs, including John Pym. Charles stormed into the House of Commons with 300 soldiers to grab them, but the MPs had already fled. This was a huge deal. It was the first time a monarch had ever entered Parliament like this, and people were outraged. The whole thing backfired spectacularly. Charles looked like a tyrant, and it showed he didn't understand the limits of his own power. After this fiasco, Charles fled London, and that was basically the point of no return. Both sides began raising armies, and the countdown to civil war had officially begun. The execution of Strafford, a sign of weakness. Another big moment came in 1641 when Charles's chief advisor, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, was executed. Strafford was accused of trying to set up a military dictatorship in Ireland, and Parliament pushed hard for his death. At first, Charles promised Strafford he'd protect him. But then, under pressure from the London mob, Charles gave in and signed the death warrant. This was a major mistake. It showed that Charles could be pushed around, and it weakened his position even more. People started to lose respect for him because it looked like he couldn't stand by his allies. Analysis. Who was really to blame? So, who's really responsible for the outbreak of the English Civil War? Let's break it down. On one hand, Parliament pushed things too far. The Grand Remonstrance, the 19 Propositions, and the Militia Ordinance were all radical moves that alienated moderates and made Charles look like a victim. It's hard to see how anyone could have compromised when Parliament kept upping the stakes. On the other hand, Charles didn't do himself any favors. His obsession with divine right, his failure to negotiate, and his disastrous attempt to arrest the 5 MPs made him look untrustworthy and authoritarian. And let's not forget the 11 years of personal rule. He set the stage for all this by ignoring Parliament for over a decade. Conclusion. In the end, the English Civil War wasn't caused by one side alone. Parliament's radical demands and Charles's stubbornness worked together to create a situation where war became inevitable. By 1642, trust had completely broken down, and both sides were ready to fight. So, what do you think? Who was more to blame, Charles or Parliament? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like and subscribe for more history deep dives. Thanks for watching, and see you next time on The Expansive Mind.